All right, good evening. That question that was on the board is one of the most important questions that we can ask. Why do we believe what we believe? Where's our belief system come from? How do we recognize the belief system of other people and ideas coming through the media and through the education system? And how do we talk with people who see the world differently? In a sense, that's what we're going to explore tonight. But I've got a quick quiz for you. I'm going to give you about 15 seconds. And I'm going to throw a screen up. I'm going to throw a slide up on the screen. And I want you to silently count the number of times you see the letter F appear. Go. All right, I'm gonna go back for a second. How many of you got none? Oh, that's a good positive sign. How many of you counted one? How many counted two? How many counted three? Let me see your hands, put them up. Okay, anybody get four? Anybody get five? Did anybody get six or more? Okay, keep your hands up, that's correct. There are 6 F's on the screen. Are you ready? There they are. Now, why did you maybe miss them? Because maybe the word of sounds like a V and you skipped it. Or maybe, even though I asked you to count the letter of the F, you actually read it, and so your mind skipped over the word of, because we're trained to read in a way where words like of and an and the don't actually contain the information, so our minds skip over them. Now, if it makes you feel any better, the first time someone gave me this quiz, I got 3 as well. Now, it's interesting. Have you ever thought about how you and I have been trained and conditioned to read a certain way? We're not even aware of it. We just do it. You might say it operates underneath the surface, and it's only when somebody draws our attention to it that we actually see it. I wonder if this is true, not just in terms of the way we read, but in terms of the way we watch a movie, the way we read the Bible, the way we engage in a conversation, the way we watch the news, the way we think about politics. Have we been trained and conditioned to process information and see the world a certain way, but unless a mirror is held up to us, we don't realize the patterns we've actually adopted? So I put it this way that might be helpful. We've all adopted ways of seeing the world that shape how we live. All of us, every single one of us, have patterns that are underneath the surface that shapes everything that we do. We're going to talk about a worldview. Everybody has a worldview. You can't not have one. But not everybody's thought about what their worldview is, how they got it, whether it's true, or whether it lines up with Scripture. So you might think about it this way. This is the way my father and I put it. Think about like a pyramid, so to speak. And this top one is what's above like the water, if you had like an iceberg. Behavior. So the way we spend our money, the way we talk, the way we act, the way we spend our time, these are our actions, and you might say this is our behavior. So things as simple as, if you're a student, how you treat your parents and friends, how hard you work at school, how you spend your money, what you eat, how you spend your time, our daily actions is what you might say our behavior. But an interesting question is, what drives our behavior? Why do we spend our money here but not there? Why do we spend our time doing this but not that? And the answer, I think, is what is next down is what we might call our values. What you value shapes how you behave and shapes how you act. Now again, think of an iceberg, and behaviors above the water, values are beneath the surface. Other people can't see them. They can see how you talk, they can see how you dress, they can see how you act, but they can't see the values motivating those things. So values shape our behavior. So if you value education, you'll spend your time and money in a certain way. If you just value kind of the pleasure and fun, you might spend your money differently. If you value the poor, you might spend your money on that. Really, how you spend your money and time is a reflection of your values. In fact, Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Like, our actions really reveal where our heart and our values are. Now, the question is, what drives our values? Why do we value certain things, but not other things? And I think the answer is because of our worldview. Our worldview, which we'll talk about, our belief system, shapes what we value, and then our values shape how we live. So our worldviews, in a sense, beneath the surface, are driving what we value and then the decisions and actions that we make. So what do we mean by a worldview? I'm going to give you a complex definition. You might want to write it down. A worldview is a view of the world. I actually think sarcasm, just for the record, is the 6th love language. I actually think it's a spiritual gift. Do you agree with that, Seth? Now, if you hear him say that in a sermon, you know where it came from, just for the record. Now, think about it this way. It is a view of the world, but you might think about it like a mental map of reality. So I was traveling in McPherson, Kansas, like the middle of America, middle of nowhere. And I like to sleep with it pitch black. I don't want any sound and any light. But the problem is I went to sleep and I woke up and had that moment of like, where am I? You ever had that moment? I woke up, I was like, where am I? And I couldn't remember. And I had put a towel under the door so it was pitch black. So I'm like walking around the room going, oh, I'm so tired, I can't remember what's going on. Finally flipped the light on. I'm like, oh, okay, I'm in the middle of nowhere in Kansas. Well, if the lights go off at my house, I know how to get to my kids. I know how to get to the sink. I know how to get out the front door. I have a mental map that matches up with my house. Think about a worldview as a mental map, but not of physical things like chairs and desks or parks or streets. Think of it as a mental map of spiritual things, which are just as real, if not more real. So it's a mental map of reality, and since reality is not physical and it's also spiritual, it helps us navigate reality. So worldview is of questions like this: what does it mean to be human? I actually think one of the biggest debates in our culture today is, what does it even mean to be human? What are we? So many of our cultural debates on ethical issues stem from a view of what a human being is. Is there life after death? Is there a purpose to life? Is there a purpose to marriage? Is God real? What brings happiness? None of these things are physical, but we all have beliefs about them that shape our values, which shape our actions. Now again, just like reading, some of us didn't realize, oh, we read things this way. The same is true with our worldview. Many of our worldviews it's like the air we breathe or the water we swim in. They're just assumptions we have that we default operate from that we maybe haven't really thought through. But that's what we mean, in a sense, by a worldview. Now, the next question is, at the very bottom, is what drives the shaping of our worldview? Where does our worldview come from? And the more I study and think about this, I think our worldview is formed primarily by relationships. If you think about why you believe what you believe, and you really laid things out there, it would be your relationships with teachers, with parents, with friends. It could be with an author, so to speak, if you have a kind of a relationship with an author that shapes the way you live. I'm convinced more and more that our worldview is shaped by our relationships. Now, I'll give you an example of this that I think is pretty powerful. There's a psychologist by the name of Paul Vitz. And Paul Vitz grew up in a Christian home in Iowa. And he went to graduate school in New York. And what's interesting about his experience in New York is he was a little bit embarrassed, so to speak, of growing up kind of from the Midwest when he went to sophisticated New York. So he describes how he learned how to dress differently because of his relationships. He learned how to talk differently. And he slowly learned how to believe differently. And he just walked away from his faith. In his 30s, he went back and started to study Christianity and began to be convinced that Christianity is true. But he wrote this book called Faith of the Fatherless. And he did a psychological study of some of the most influential atheists in history: Nietzsche, Camus, Freud, Marx. And he said, interestingly, almost all of them have a strange factor in common: a dead, distant, or harsh father. What's his point? Our human relationships shape the way we think about God. In particular, the Bible describes God as a heavenly father. We understand the fatherhood of God largely through the experiences we have with our fathers, for better or for worse. Relationships shape our worldviews. My dad grew up, my grandfather was the town drunk, died long before I was born, lived in Michigan. And my dad was an agnostic. And he'd hear Christians say things like, yeah, the Heavenly Father who loves you. And my dad's dad was an abusive drunk. And his thought was, why would I want a Heavenly Father when Father equals this? So for better or worse, whether we realize it or not, we all tend to import our experiences and our relationships onto God. That's why, amazingly, one of the most effective ways to evangelize people is through relationships. When people think Christians are bigoted, hateful, intolerant homophobes, and they meet a Christian who's not that way, what happens? It starts to potentially change and shift their worldview. So our behavior is shaped by what we value. What we value comes from our worldview, and our worldviews are profoundly shaped by our relationships. Maybe later, not now when you're discussing your group, you could share a relationship with somebody that deeply influenced you or for better or worse in terms of how you see the world. Now, there's another way that might help us to think about worldview. You can think about worldview as an individual belief system, but you can also realize that there are larger worldviews that try to make sense of the world in which we live. And you might say worldviews answer three questions. So when I began to look at the world through these three questions, it's like I see competing worldviews everywhere. So the first question a worldview answers is, how did we get here? This is the creation account. What you might say is the origin story. Every worldview has some account of where we came from, how we got here, and why we're here. That's what we call like the creation or the origin story. Now the second one is, why is the world messed up, the fall? Why are things broken? What accounts for the division and the anger and the polarization and the sexism and racism, whatever it is? What accounts for that in our world? Why are things so broken? That's what we call the fall. And then the third one is what we call the solution or redemption, how we fix it. Every worldview, every belief system explains how we got here, what's wrong with the world, and how we fix it. This is, in a sense, what worldviews do. So take, for example, Buddhism. Buddhism says we've eternally been here going through the cycle of samsara. There's actually no beginning point. What's wrong with the world is we have desires. And because of our desires, they cause suffering. So the solution is to follow the eightfold path and get rid of your desires. That's what you might call the Buddhist story. Another example, take Islam. In Islam, they believe in a personal creator who made the world. The problem in the world is not sin. The problem is that people are just not submitted to Allah. That's the problem. A Muslim, by definition, is one who submits. So redemption is submitting to Allah. That's what you might call the Muslim story. Now, many of you have heard more and more about critical theory or critical race theory. This is a worldview I think that's embedded in our culture that basically says we are human beings in power struggles. And what's wrong with the world is some people have power and others don't. And the solution is through revolution and revolt to get rid of these power differences. People who buy into critical theory literally see the world through the oppressors and those who are oppressed. So I tell my students at Bible, I say, if you want to know who the ultimate oppressor is, you're looking at them. In other words, I dot every I and cross every T. I'm a Christian, I'm heterosexual, I'm white, I don't know that I'm rich, but all of us live in Southern Orange County, so we're all doing pretty well, all things considered. I'm able-bodied, I'm middle-aged, what am I missing? Male, that's kind of a big one. The obvious one, I am cisgender, which means I'm not transgender according to the term. I'm the ultimate oppressor on that worldview of critical theory. That's literally a lens through which they see the world. So if you listen to certain people who embrace critical theory, they will look at a scenario and they won't say, is there sexism or is there racism? They'll say there is sexism and there is racism. I just need to find how it's expressed. That's because of their worldview that they embrace. Other examples we keep going would be something like secular humanism. Since secular humanism is an atheistic worldview, there's not a belief in God. So there's some kind of Big Bang, something from nothing. Evolutionary story would be the creation account. Now you tell me, on secular humanism, what's wrong with the world? What's the fall? Us, that's a good answer. And us means what? Christians, religious folks. And the solution, religion brings bigotry and hatred and intolerance. So the solution is what? Get rid of religion and create a secular state. All of these are stories. And we could talk about other worldviews like consumerism, which is everywhere in Southern Orange County, is that we are made to buy things and be happy. But the problem is we can't buy and have enough stuff. The solution is buy the next product and you'll be happy. Consumerism is basically a story about what it means to be human and what brings happiness. All of these worldviews, we could talk about transgender ideology is actually a kind of worldview. According to transgender ideology, basically what's wrong with the world is we divide the world into male and female. We are sexless beings. We divide the world into male and female, which causes suffering. So the solution is to get rid of distinctions and categories of male and female. That's basically what you might call a kind of transgender narrative. Now, we're going to come back and do some questions, but let me frame for you kind of the three big overarching worldviews. And then when we come back, you're going to discuss at your tables. We'll come back and we'll try to make this a little bit more practical for you. But one big worldview that things like secular humanism and Marxism and critical theory would fall under is what's called naturalism. Natural is the basic idea that there is no God, and natural forces are sufficient to explain everything. Everything can be explained by science. So according to naturalism, where do we come from? Creation account, his universe came from nothing and by nothing and for nothing. You are a cosmic accident or evolved animal, you might say. That's the naturalistic story. And what's wrong with the world on naturalism as well? Humanity has messed things up. Humanity's messed things up. And what's the solution? Aslan is not going to come save the day. We must solve our own problems primarily through what? Through science, exactly. So movies that kind of push that idea of science is like The Martian with Matt Damon. I'm not saying that's a bad movie, I enjoyed it. But the idea of that movie is if you just work hard enough and use math and science, you can solve our problems. That's how that worldview kind of seeps through. Now I want to show you a clip in a second. But one of the things I try to teach my kids is that these worldviews are everywhere if we just pay attention to them. So one of the most popular television shows, especially among students over the past 5 to 6 years, is the TV show Stranger Things. Now, because of COVID and the strike, it's like dragged this on way longer than it needs to. But how many of you have seen Stranger Things? I have, so no judgment. I'm curious. Okay, good. More than I thought. Now, when I first saw season 1 of Stranger Things, I thought, oh, this is a supernatural story. Because there's an upside down world that seems like hell. Will was possessed by this mind flayer. And you had these demon type beings called demogorgons. But then I started to watch the show a little more carefully. I thought, wait a minute. When the kids are trying to figure out what the problem is, they don't go to a priest or a pastor or a shaman. Who do they go to? Their science teacher. So actually, Stranger Things is really subtly subverting the supernatural worldview and showing, if you look hard enough, there's naturalistic explanations for everything. So by the time you get to season 4, there's this Satan-type figure called what? This is the participatory part of the program. Vecna, right? Vecna's like a Satan-type figure. And they have a haunted house, and they have demon possessions. But then what happens? They slowly explain it away naturally. I'm not saying Stranger Things is bad or don't watch it. I'm saying watch closely and ask, what is the story doing? How is faith being presented? What world is being shown through this TV show? And by the way, I actually think movies and film can be some of the most powerful ways to shape us because our guards go down. When you're being preached to or you're hearing a political sermon, you know someone's trying to persuade you. When you watch a movie, you just think it's entertainment. And so our guard is down, and we're actually potentially susceptible to more influence. That's what we call naturalism. I want to show you a quick clip from the end of a movie about Stephen Hawking. And have you seen the movie Theory of Everything? It's probably, I don't know, maybe 5, 6 years old. This is the end of the movie. So oftentimes when you get to the end of a movie, directors feel like they can preach at you a little bit because they've earned you staying with them through the film. And so Richard Dawkins, this atheist, asks Stephen Hawking a question, and just listen to the music, watch how people's faces turn on him, and listen to how they're like setting up this worldview, which is really naturalism, as being somewhat heroic. Hopefully this works. Take a look.
You have said you do not believe in God. Do you have a philosophy of life that helps you?
Inspiring music.
It is clear that we are just an advanced breed of primates on a minor planet, orbiting around a very average star in the outer suburb of one among 100 billion galaxies. But ever since the dawn of civilization, people have craved for an understanding of the underlying order of the world. There ought to be something very special about the boundary conditions of the universe. And what can be more special than that there is no boundary? And there should be no boundary to human endeavor. We are all different. However bad life may seem, there is always something you can do, and succeed at. While there is life, there is hope.
All right, you notice how that started. We're on some star in a galaxy, tiny, like in the middle of nowhere. But while there's life, there's hope. To convince us of this, they had heads like tilted, right? People leaning in. They had inspiring music. This is the worldview of existentialism. You see it in movies like The Truman Show, if you remember that show, or Yes Man, or if you go way back to the 80s, the Carpe Diem movie, my mind's going blank. Like I said, Dead Poets Society, thank you. You knew that fast. Dead Poets Society, there is no God, seize the day, and you can have meaning without God. That's a naturalistic attempt to find hope and meaning without God. That's naturalism. I think naturalism has seeped all over our culture and in many ways seeped into the church. When we pray, do we really believe God is listening? Do you really believe God can do miracles? Do we really believe God's Spirit is inside of us? I think naturalism has powerfully influenced the church. So worldviews of naturalism would be like critical theory, Marxism, secular humanism, and nihilism. Now, another prominent worldview, last one we'll look at, and then we'll set you loose at your tables to kind of discuss this a little bit, is pantheism. So really, there's three broad worldviews, right? There's like monotheism, the Christianity, Islam, and Judaism strain. And then there's naturalism, and then there's pantheism. Now, what's the difference between a pandemic and an epidemic? An epidemic is localized. A pandemic is where? Everywhere, right? We all know that intimately. Pan means everything. So pantheism literally means that all is God. We are seeing in our culture right now a big increase and interest in things like astrology and New Age. So there's been a bump back from certain atheistic worldviews, but that doesn't mean people are turning to Christianity. They're turning to alternate spiritualities. And this is massive in our culture. It's massive in media. But it basically tells a story. So in the pantheism sense, all is God. There's really no difference between you and me, matter and spirit. All is one, all is God. So basically the pantheistic story would be something like, humans are part of the eternal divine consciousness. So there's a divine consciousness that's out there, and you and I are all a part of this. Now what's wrong with the world is we forgot that we are divine. We have been severed from our connection of the divine. And so if the problem is we forgot we're God, then what's the solution? To remember. Exactly. Look, the bottom line is if you want to know how to fix something, you got to identify the problem first. And we'll come back to that. We forgot we're divine, so what's the solution? To become one with the universe through practices that help remind us of our inner godhood, so to speak. That's what's meant by New Age. Now, we see this all over films, and I'm going to give you an example of a classic one. But you see this obviously in movies like Avatar, Moana, Pocahontas, but a clip from one of the great movies of all time. Exactly. Listen to the language in this.
I can't. It's too big.
Size matters not. Look at me. Judge me by my size, do you? And where you should not. For my ally is the Force, and a powerful ally it is. Life creates it, makes it grow. Its energy surrounds things shall be not this crude matter. You must feel the force around you. Here, between you, me, the tree, the rock, everywhere. Yes, even between the land and the ship.
You want the impossible.
I mean, that is literally a mini sermon of New Age, isn't it? Now, my response is not, this is bad, don't watch it, retreat. I don't think that's helpful. I think we as Christians can lean in appropriately and with wisdom and actually see that within these stories, they actually give hints that Christianity is true. So George Lucas was asked years ago, the theme behind Star Wars. And he said, I asked my mom when I was like 10, if there's one God, why are there so many religions? And the conclusion I came to is that all religions are true. So he tried to have Star Wars kind of tell these epic, greater themes. But what's interesting is when you get to episode 9, Kylo Ren is the bad guy, and he's so full of evil. What brings redemption to Kylo Ren? The willing sacrifice of his mom, Leia. That loving sacrifice turns his heart and brings him to redemption. That doesn't sound like Buddhism to me. That doesn't sound like New Age or atheism. That sounds a lot like the Christian worldview. That it's sacrifice and love that actually turns us away from evil. Now, when it comes to worldviews, to have the right solution, you've got to first diagnose the problem. If you don't diagnose the problem, your solution won't work. So if your car runs out of gas, it doesn't do any good to rotate the tires, plug it into an EV, or get new spark plugs. You got to recognize the problem and fix it. Marxism says the problem is there's haves and there's have-nots. The problem is external in the world. New Age says the problem is that we forgot that we are God. Right? Critical theory says the problem is there's oppressed and oppressors. What Jesus said is the problem is the human heart. The heart of the problem is the problem of the heart. It's sin. That's why grace through faith is what leads to transformation from the inside out. Now, a ton more can be said. This is kind of 30,000 foot view level. Seth asked me to talk about what is a worldview, how do we see it in culture, what are some different worldviews, etc. We're going to set you loose in just a minute. Seth, make your way up here to have some discussions at your table. Then I'm going to come back at the end, and we're going to have a time of Q&A. If you have specific questions about how to apply this or different worldviews, I would love to do my best to help us make sense of this in our family, our lives, and ministry. So take it away.
All right. We are going to go into some question and answer time, if that sounds all right with you. I've got Stacy Tertani right here. She also has a microphone, so we can sort of walk throughout the room. If you've got a question, why don't you raise your hand, and then one of us will come to you, and you can ask a question, and Sean will give a response. Okay, boom.
Oh, there's Sean. Sean, I wanted to ask you the difference of worldviews between Christianity and Mormonism, because I feel like that's kind of the other religion that most of us interact with here in San Clemente, and especially with our kids. So how do we as parents teach our kids the difference?
Great question. You're right. The Latter-day Saint community here is huge. So Mormonism came out of historical Christianity in the 1800s. Joseph Smith, as a teenager, claimed to go out and pray in the backwoods in Palmyra, New York, and say, which sect do I follow? And he meant like Baptist, Wesleyan, different Christian sects, so to speak. And he said God the Father appeared to him and said, don't follow any of them. I'm going to restore the church through you. So it's an offshoot of historic Christianity. So you see similar practices and you see very similar words and terms, but they mean very different things within Mormonism. So their view of the scriptures, they'll say the Bible's inspired insofar as it's translated correctly, but point to the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price as additional scriptures as well that have some different teachings from the Bible. They'll talk about Jesus being God and agree with you on that, but what they mean about Jesus being God is very different than what you and I would mean. So one of the presidents, I think it was in the 70s, I could be wrong on that, was Lorenzo Snow. And he says, as man is, God once was, as God is, man can become. In other words, their view is that God was once a man. And that God at that time had a God who was once a man, who at that time had a God who was once a man. So it actually goes back for infinity, so to speak. I was at BYU and I asked a student, I said, hey, I'm curious, does this go back forever? Or is there like a first God that started all of this? And he's like, it's a mystery. I was like, okay. So technically, Mormonism is polytheistic. There are multiple gods. They'll talk about salvation by faith and grace, but what they mean is very different. So Ephesians 2:8-9 says, it is by grace you have been saved, and this is a gift from God, not from yourself, so no one can boast. Nephi 25:23 says, it is by grace you have been saved after all that you can do. It's a very different understanding of the relationship between faith and works. So bottom line, one of my best friends growing up, we're still in touch, is a Latter-day Saint. I mean, my goodness, you talk about hardworking, moral, kind people. That is the Latter-day Saint community by far. But the bottom line is we'll use very similar words, but underneath it, a very different understanding of who Jesus is, the character of God, the means of salvation, and the nature of the afterlife. So I just teach my kids to ask questions and point out some of the differences that are underneath the surface. But befriend your Latter-day Saint neighbors and just look for a natural opportunity to talk with them. One thing I found is we used to do trips to Salt Lake City and we'd go engage with Mormons. And then we do trips to Berkeley and go engage with atheists. If I ever invited atheists, like, let me come talk to Christians, tell you why you're wrong, let's have a debate, it was really difficult to get any Latter-day Saints to come. And I think some of that is just the nature of the culture. If you sound like you're against their beliefs, you can get pegged very quickly as being anti-Mormon. So just be very wise and strategic, in my experience, how you would gauge Latter-day Saints. Single best website is mrm.org. MormonResearchMinistry.org. The head of that, a friend and I, we actually wrote a book together called How to Share the Good News with Mormons. We edited it, and it's that he works for the Mormon Research Ministry. And that website, podcast, articles, they're both missionaries and they're really good scholars, and they're friends of mine. I trust them. So that is the site I would go to for sure. Good question.
Great question. Okay, let's go over here.
Well, what does it look like to be pegged as anti-Mormon?
Hold it right up there like ice cream. Just don't lick it.
What does it look like to be pegged as anti-Mormon?
What does it look like?
What are you saying? What does it look like to be like if someone says you're an anti-Mormon? Well, what kinds of things are you saying? Oh, what do they do bad? What's the repercussions?
first off, in my experience, Latter-day Saints are kind and they're not going to attack you as a whole. They just might not want to have these conversations. They might close it off. They might in their mind say, you're anti-Mormon, so I don't want to have this conversation with you. That's what I mean by it. So.
Good. Jason?
Good job. Way to spread out the questions to get his steps in today. Good strategy.
I just wanted to riff on that for a second. Because going back to the idea of relationships and the idea of like we are influenced and our worldview is influenced by relationships. So it's who we spend our time with and how those people's relationships are influenced. So even that piece of Mormonism and the way that the nomenclature can be interpreted in two different ways, and it's like, hey, their words are very similar to ours, but they mean something very different. At some point, someone was influenced by a relationship with someone who twisted those words, and now their whole worldview is completely different because of that. And how many different ways is it alive today in our world with media, social media, other things, where we have all these relationships that are feeding us information. How do we discern what's truth and what's not, and where the relationships that we believe are fruitful for us are real versus influenced?
That's a great question. So we have more information today than ever, but it's harder to discern truth in some ways than ever. And it's harder for students because all they got to do is Google or pull up TikTok or search on artificial intelligence, and you find somebody smart with another perspective. So I look for people, for podcasts I listen to, books that I read, people I follow on Twitter. I try to look for people who I think really care about truth. And that's true on news. Like people I follow on news, I'm like, that person asks the right questions and they care about truth. I look on that in authors that I read, and not always just Christians. There's some Christians I'm like, they've got an agenda. I don't trust them. I'm not going to follow after them. So I could walk through in different areas, different writers that I listen to. Like in apologetics, a guy named Mike Licona is a friend of mine, one of the experts on the resurrection. I've never seen anybody so lay out, here's my biases, here's my methodology, lay out his reasoning, take criticism and respond to it. I'm like, wow, here's somebody who really wants to know truth. I think in news, I enjoy listening to Megyn Kelly's podcast. I don't agree with her on everything, but I think she asks really good questions. And I've seen her change her mind on some significant issues, which tells me she cares about truth. And so I just look for people. Do they change their minds on things? And I also make sure for me, like I read the New York Times almost every morning. And that is a left-leaning publication. And my wife can't stand it. She's like, why do you read that? I'm like, I have to see another perspective. And I have to ask myself, am I wrong about something? So the podcasts I listen to on both sides, the news sources that I read on both sides, YouTube channel, both sides, books on both sides. But I'm also looking on both sides for people to go, do they really care about truth? So Wolf and I were talking, I just had a conversation on critical race theory. I posted on my YouTube channel yesterday. It was 2 hours. And I've been so trying to think, how should we Christians respond? And there's some people on one side that are like, it's of the devil and it's destroying things and it's terrible. And if you just listen to them and they're right on certain things, I wonder if we're missing something. And then there's some people on the other side that are so pro-CRT, I'm like, I'm not sure you see the areas of concern that are here. So I brought 2 of my friends on. One is a little bit more, I don't know if I'd say pro-CRT, but he's more amenable to ideas we should pay attention to, and one who's more critical of it. I read both their books. I brought them on and tried to ask tough questions, and then I try to figure out what I believe about it. I don't know any other way to approach it than that. And then just follow other people who I think are thinkers like that. It's a great question.
Sean, there's a lot of shallow thinking with people that I've spoken to. And maybe they have 1 inch of information about whatever they're passionate about. How do you open up that conversation to get them to go a little deeper and think more broadly or think deeper about something other than just a soundbite, a 10-second idea about something?
Yeah, that's a good question. Now, if that's on Twitter, that's going to be a different conversation than face-to-face. Because I don't think most people on Twitter really want to have that conversation. You got to consider the medium. But assume I'm talking to somebody in person, I always ask myself this question. Not that I always do it well, but this is my goal. How is what I want to accomplish and what I think is true going to land? And how do I best communicate in a way that it'll be received well? So if I say to that person, so you've read one book and you think you got it all figured out, that's pretty shallow. How do you think that's going to be received? Not well. Now there's a time to be critical with people and say, that's ridiculous. You need to think more. Shame on you. There's a time and place for that. But I think we lean into that too quickly. So if this is a subject I know a little bit about, I might just say, hey, that's an interesting perspective. Have you read this book? Have you considered this study? As I've thought about this, people have asked me this question, which made me rethink certain things. I'm wondering how you might answer this. And I'm just going to try to ask questions. Honestly, Jesus told stories and he asked questions. The Gospels record 341 questions of Jesus. In Paul's letters, there's 262. Jesus was asked 183 questions, and if I remember correctly, he directly answered 7. That's why I never answer my wife. No, I'm kidding. That's not true. That's so not true. But I'm going to ask questions and try to surface and help that person think differently. Now, can I make somebody know? I've had conversations with people and I can tell pretty quickly, mind made up, this is my view, not interested in another perspective. And then I probably am not going to waste a ton of time trying to change their perspectives. At times I've said, you know what? Sounds like you got it all figured out. Have you even read a book on the other side? I've asked that question, but usually that's after I've tried to engage and I've tried to make people think. I actually think most people in the right setting and the right time are open to have meaningful, tough conversations on the most difficult issues. If we just listen and we show charity to them. It doesn't always work. Even Jesus let the rich young ruler walk away. But that's how I'm going to lean in and try to engage it best I can.
All right, we've got one right over here. Stephen?
So, Sean, my question has to, there's a lot of talk amongst people of faith even that are deconstructing their faith, following progressive Christianity. There is no hell. God wouldn't send people to hell. Rob Bell comes to mind as one of the thinkers in that realm. Is that a movement that we need to be more aware of and concerned about in churches and society today?
This is a big question. So the term deconstruction has a lot of different ways people use it. So if a young person ever says to you, I'm deconstructing my faith, here's the next question. What do you mean by deconstruction? So with a co-author of mine, actually at Biola, I wrote a book called Set Adrift, How to Deconstruct Without Losing Your Faith. In other words, there's a way deconstruction is sometimes used that means I'm rethinking what it means to follow Jesus. I'm rethinking certain things that have been passed on to me, but I want to follow Jesus and I want to be faithful to Scripture. That kind of deconstruction is the way many people use that term. There's another term, deconstruction, that means I'm rejecting my faith, I'm walking away, and I'm trying to rid myself of these fundamentalist, fill-in-the-blank beliefs. Now, Elisa Childers and Tim Barnett wrote a book called The Deconstruction of Christianity. And they spent a ton of time looking at people who have YouTube channels about deconstruction, people who have TikTok platforms, people on Instagram, and they hashtag deconstruction. And there's a number of people out there trying to encourage others to deconstruct their faith. And they wrote a book identifying it, giving examples, and raising concern about it. I have some concerns about that, But I guess I approach it a little bit differently in the sense of let's lean in and talk with young people and ask them what questions you have, why are you questioning your faith, what's going on, and help walk with them through the questions that they have. I interviewed Tim and Elisa, they're both friends of mine, on YouTube maybe 6 months ago. And they talk about the entire movement of deconstruction. We talk about what we have in common, maybe what we should be concerned about, where we differ. So if that's helpful, just search in deconstruction on YouTube. That'll show up. And you can see us kind of toss around different perspectives about this, go back and forth. And then we ultimately agree on how we should approach this moving forward.
That is great. I know we have lots more questions. I saw Bruce.
Sorry, we also have two over here when you're done.
Okay. All right, so time-wise, I think we only have time for one more. Probably. Okay. And now it's awkward, because I don't know who should have the last question. All right, we'll do
Let's
two. Bruce?
Ladies first? No?
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
So just help me understand. When I'm thinking of a microbiologist, an intelligent person who can explain how protein and amino acids work in our bodies, that create and produce these functions, like just the body mechanism itself. How can they not realize that we were wonderfully, marvelously created, and that all this stuff is not just a random thing that works so well together?
That's a really interesting question. In some ways, when I hear that, I hesitate to give a generalized answer because there's so many microbiologists with so many different experiences, with so many different reasons why they don't believe. Now, of course, there's a lot of microbiologists who do. So I somewhat hesitate to give a blanket answer, but here's some. For some cases, there could be spiritual blindness. There could be spiritual forces at play. For some people, it could be worldview. I mean, if you don't believe God exists, or if you think God maybe exists, but he doesn't intervene in nature, and then you look through your microscope, you're going to have to explain everything through some naturalistic process. If that's the assumption you begin with, then you're going to have to fill in the blanks after that. So it could be spiritual blindness. It could just be somebody's different worldview. Some cases, it's an experience somebody who a microbiologist has with Christians and has with people who believe in God. Maybe they're viewed as being anti-science. I talked to the physics student from biology and from Berkeley, and I remember he said to me specifically, he's like, you believe Jesus rose from the grave. Science says people stay dead. So how can you believe in this? What he was basically saying was, if I have to embrace your worldview, I have to completely abandon science. Now, I pointed out to him that it's actually Christians who led the scientific revolution. And you can believe that dead people stay dead and that there's a God who can work through and above the laws of nature, and that doesn't violate science. But what I want to know in this circumstance is the particular microbiologist. What's their experience with Christians? What's their worldview? What is their story? That's what I want to know. So there's a proverb that says the purposes in a man or a person's heart are deep, and a person of wisdom draws it out. Isn't that brilliant? Almost whenever when I'm talking with somebody, I want to know, what's the real heart issue? What's the question beneath the question? And so many times if you listen and you ask the right questions, you can get to the heart of it. That's what I want to know for any microbiologist. But I'm with you. I don't know how anybody looks at nature and doesn't realize that there's a God, especially those who can look at DNA.
All right, one last one.
Oh, me or you?
You're up.
Oh, okay. This is kind of big. Sorry, I don't have much time. But the whole homosexuality thing, I think, is such a huge topic. All of us, come across people, and I know our kids are like, well, they're born that way, so how, it's not their fault, or that's just who God made them to be, and why can't we accept them for who they are? They still believe in God, they're fine, da-da-da. And so that's a hard topic. That's a hard thing, because you see, even in children sometimes, like mannerisms that look kind of in a way that you're like, yeah, there's something different there, and it's like, it just is a really tough concept, and I just wanted to get your 2 cents on it.
So Sean, 15 seconds.
15 seconds.
You got this.
Solve that problem for us.
So
Make it profound, please, because
I've written on this. I've had a lot of public conversations with progressive Christians who say God is fine with homosexuality and same-sex behavior. If that's interesting to you on YouTube, you can see me go toe-to-toe with quite a few people on this. I'd be happy to do a seminar sometime in the future on this. Like, I'm not looking to fill up my calendar, but if it's helpful, I would do it for you. Let me say a couple things. What's the core of the issue? Is there a God who has made us to live a certain way? If there's not a God, I don't think we can say not only that anything is wrong, but that any kind of immoral sexual behavior is wrong. So is there a designer who has made our bodies to function a certain way? And has this designer revealed himself? If so, then regardless of how we feel, there is a truth outside of ourselves that we need to conform ourselves to actually be set free. The hard part about this question is that I think students today are so permeated with this idea of affirming whatever somebody believes and however they feel, don't be a bigot. That you talk about worldview, it's the air they breathe and the water they swim with, and don't even realize how deeply they have been shaped by ideas in the culture more so than what Scripture says. That's what's hard. So the bottom line is we've got to balance grace and we've got to balance truth. It's actually truth that sets people free. It is. But we've got to be gracious and kind and loving with people. And this is why this is a whole different talk, but I'll tell you when it comes to kids, you want to know what the research shows about passing on your faith? It basically shows if you want to pass on your faith, it's 3 things. Number 1, you have to model a faith that your kids find attractive. You have to model it. Number 2, build intimate, close relationships with your kids. And number 3, have meaningful spiritual conversations with your kids about issues in life. So if they find that your life is authentic, not perfect, but you're living out the Christian life, and you have a relationship with them, they will most likely listen to you as you talk about God's design for sexuality, God's design for relationships. They will. And can I tell one quick story that might help? Here's just how I try to do this with my kids. My son wanted to see the movie Bohemian Rhapsody about the rock band. Oh, now you participate. Oh, yeah, see how it is. I'm kidding. He was 14, he was PG-13, had a little bit of concern. I read about it. I'm like, okay. I said, hey, buddy, he's 20 now. I said, I'll take you to see this movie. I'll spend $100 on tickets and popcorn if when we're done, you just sit down with me for 20 minutes and just tell me what you think about it. He goes, sure, Dad. So we went to the Crown Valley Theater, if I remember correctly, and we sat down. I said, hey, what did you think about the movie? What was your favorite scene? Did anything surprise you? On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate how interesting it was? I said, are there any things as Christians watching this movie that gave you pause? Are there any times you felt this movie was preaching at you? And there's a scene in that movie where, what's the lead singer's name again? Like I said, Freddie Mercury. He's gay and he comes out with his wife or girlfriend. And she's like, I'm so mad, but I know that you can't do anything about it because you're born this way. And my son goes, Dad, would it really happen like that in the 80s? I was like, it never would have happened that way in the 80s. You picked up on how this movie is trying to push an agenda on you. He picked up on that. The point being, built a relationship. Hopefully my wife and I model this in a way they find attractive, and we have conversations with them over and over again every chance we get to try to help them see God's design for sex, love, and marriage, and also how we love people who see the world differently. That's my 15, maybe 16-second answer.
Great
now,
job.
I'd
Hey,
say
can we
this
give
really, can I get
Sean,
real fast?
Thanks,
So
yes.
I brought...
Yeah, I wanted you to talk about those. Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
I brought some books, and they're at my cost, roughly, back there. And I mean roughly because I don't want to charge you $9.58. And 2 books. One is a book I wrote called Rebels Manifesto for students, the 25 like thorniest ethical issues. So like gun control, immigration, the transgender conversation, race. How do we think Christianly about this? Short chapters meant to just have conversations with the next generation about these things, or even come up with some talking points yourself. So that's back there. Then my newest book with my dad is called 12 Crucial Truths. What we didn't talk about is the Christian worldview. One of the best ways to start recognizing faulty worldviews is to really own and understand the unique Christian worldview, and then we see it out there. And this book is meant to not only help us see it, but live it out in relationships. So those are back there again, roughly my cost, $10 each, special deal, 2 for $20. Thanks.
Sean, thank you so much. Truly, I know each and every person in here appreciated this greatly, and would we like to hear more from Sean in the future? I think absolutely. But yes, we know you have a full speaking schedule and all that, but really special and powerful for you to be here. So thank you. 2 quick things in closing. Number 1, this is a life group community night. So if there are some of you who are feeling like, hey, I came, I knew Sean was going to be speaking, but I would like to get into a life group, I would like to launch or host a life group, we would love to invite you to do that, to fill out an application online. You can do that. We have a very simple process. We'll put it up on the screen. It's basically 3 things that have to do with hosting a group. Find your people, grab a guide, which I'm holding right here, go and let us know. You like that? Find your people, grab a guide, go and let us know. For many years at the Shoreline, we were trying to play matchmaker, which can be very challenging when people just say, hey, you know what? I'm looking for a group on Tuesday nights in Ladera Ranch after 8 p.m. And I'm like, well, we don't have any of those groups. I'm sorry. But the whole idea of things like this is that we get to know people, we sit around tables, we do life with one another, and as you connect with others, the goal is to find your people, to ask, even in groups like tonight, to say, hey, are you in a group? Have you thought about being in a group? What if we did a group, you know? And it could be even for a season. That's the other thing. I think sometimes people get apprehensive about joining or starting a group if they think life group means life sentence, which it doesn't. You can do it for a season, right? And that's all great. So Megan, hold up. You've got those are the guides in the back. So if you're like, yeah, maybe we would like to launch a group, talk to Megan, grab a guide, and you can fill out something online to let us know more about you as well. Okay. Stacy Trotani, our missions director, is here, and she wants to tell you about one opportunity for you and your groups to serve together.
Yes, it wouldn't be complete without a serving opportunity for your group. And we know how much serving together as a group brings your group closer together, and there's a way you can do that while helping a family in need at the same time. Through our partners at Olive Crest, we are hearing about more and more needs in the community where crisis hits a family. Most often it's a single parent family, and they have no safety net for a place to put their kids while they take care of the crisis and stabilize. And so our strategy to sort of step into this here at the Shoreline is called the Harbor. And a harbor, as we know, is a safe place during life's storms. And so we have sort of a 2-pronged approach. And the first prong is hosting kids in your home. And that could be for a weekend, it could be for a week or a month or even longer. There are a slew of situations that families find themselves in that would lead to this. For example, maybe mom is having another baby, needs to go into the hospital, and leaving her kids with a neighbor or a family member is not safe for them. So there's so many examples of why this could be. Maybe she was evicted and needs to find another place, or lost her job and just needs a few days to interview while knowing her kids are being taken care of in a safe and loving home. So if you're interested in that piece, that's our hosting kids piece. Basically, there is a application process through Olive Crest. My husband and I are actually starting that right now. And once you're approved to host kids, you basically just get on a text list. Texts will come through as needs arise, and if it works for your family, you can respond, and if it doesn't, you can just ignore the text. So logistically, that's how that one happens. And the second prong of our two-pronged approach is what we're calling care communities, and these are groups of 6 to 8 people or a life group, just like yours, that rally together to support a family that's hosting kids. And that could be bringing diapers if it's a baby they're hosting. It could be bringing a meal to take the load off, any number of things to ensure a successful hosting. And what this is doing is kind of swimming upstream and preventing major problems before they start. It gives the parent in crisis a safety net, and most of all, it keeps kids out of the foster care system, where, as we know, statistics show that kids who grow up in foster care are, 90% more likely of being trafficked and, higher chances of drug and alcohol abuse, and the list goes on. I'm thinking back to when we first started this strategy, and it was probably about 2010, and it was a life group just like yours with a few families in it that said yes to hosting, and they shared the load over the course of several years for little Alex and Helen, who were found in a storage unit living there with their mom who couldn't take care of them. And fast forward to about 5 or 6 years ago, Helen got married, and each of the men in that life group gave her away on her wedding day because they became family just by doing what families and groups are already doing. Alex, her brother, is about 25 now, and I got word last month that he was staying with one of his previous hosts and helping them with another hosting. So we're starting to see things come full circle, and there's just been some beautiful fruit that's come from it, and we want you to experience that. So you can see a little QR code on the screen. If you're at all interested, just fill out that form, and we will contact you. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Stacy. So great. Let me pray, and and we'll get out of here. Father, thank you so much for tonight. Thank you for the Christian worldview. Thank you that it is the worldview that makes sense of ultimate reality. Thank you for Sean. We pray blessing over his family, his ministry, his kids, Lord. It's truly just inspiring to hear from him and to hear from his mind and his heart, Lord. And we just pray that we truly would be carriers of your truth, that we would be defenders of faith, that we would be salt and light in culture. And above all, Lord, that we would do all of these things in love, that we would model your way, Lord. And we just thank you for the time of learning and how rich it was tonight. We love you in Jesus' name. Everybody said, amen. Thanks you guys so much for coming.